I've kept it deeply grounded, calm, and immersive, like the music itself. She hadn't meant to come back. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but life has its own tempo, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, and this time it pulled her home without asking. It was late October, the kind of autumn where the air smells like damp earth and old paper, where the light turns soft and honey gold in the afternoons, and the city feels like it's holding its breath before winter. Vienna wore its age like a well-tailored coat, dignified, familiar, slightly worn at the elbows. Trams clattered past chestnut trees, shedding their last leaves. Street musicians played waltzes with mittened hands. Everything was just as she remembered. And yet, nothing was. She walked slowly, her coat pulled close, a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder. Her steps weren't hurried, more like someone trying to postpone arrival. Like coming home wasn't a comfort, but a duty. Or maybe a question. She used to run through these streets as a girl, darting between bookshops and cafes. Fingers still smelling of piano keys, humming fragments of whatever she'd practiced that morning. Back then, music wasn't just sound. It was how she understood the world. How joy felt like a rising scale. How sadness had the weight of a minor chord held too long. She'd studied at the conservatory, then medicine, not to leave music behind, but to carry it deeper into places where words failed. Now she was a doctor, a neurologist. She'd spent years in high-pressure hospitals, treating stroke patients, managing traumatic injuries, sitting with families in the quiet aftermath of bad news. She'd been good at it, calm, precise, trusted. But somewhere along the way, the calm had become silence. Not peaceful silence, the heavy kind. The kind that settles in your bones when you've listened to too many heartbeats flatline, too many voices break. And then, a few months ago, her mentor, the man who'd encouraged her to blend science and art, who'd loaned her his first vinyl of Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg Variations, had passed away, quietly in his sleep. At 84, it wasn't sudden, but it felt like a door closing. A final one. She hadn't cried at the funeral, not once. She'd helped organize the service, written part of the eulogy, shaken hands, accepted hugs, all with a steady voice and dry eyes. People said, "She's so strong." But strength, she was learning, isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's just exhaustion wearing a brave face. Her hands had started doing something strange lately. When she was still waiting for an elevator, reading a chart, sitting in her small apartment with a cup of tea going cold, they'd tremble. Just slightly. A fine, almost invisible shake. Like a tuning fork after the note has faded. She'd hide them in her pockets, or grip the edge of a desk until it stopped. She told herself it was fatigue. Too much caffeine. Stress. As if stress were a single thing, and not a slow accumulation like dust on a piano lid. Unnoticed until you run your finger across it. Sleep had become a negotiation. She'd lie in bed, eyes closed, replaying the day, a patient's confused glance. A missed detail in a scan, the tone of her own voice, too sharp, too flat, too tired. And beneath it all, the old, quiet guilt. You walked away from the piano. You chose scalpels over sonatas. Was it worth it? She didn't know anymore. That afternoon the rain began, a soft, misty drizzle that blurred the streetlights and made the cobblestones shine. She ducked into a cafe, ordered a meringue, and sat near the window, watching the world soften behind glass. The cafe played music, something light, forgettable. Elevator music, really. Pleasant, but hollow, like background noise designed to keep silence at bay, not to meet it. Then, as she stirred sugar into her coffee, slowly, watching the swirls dissolve, she noticed a small poster taped to the cafe's community board. Faded at the edges. Handwritten in neat black ink, restorative listening series music as medicine A space, to simply be no talking. No analysis, no performance, just listening. Tonight, 6:30 p.m. Music Varian. Small hall, free. All are welcome. She read it 3 times. Music as medicine. It sounded like something her mentor would have said, half joking, half deeply serious over a glass of wine after a long day. You know, sometimes a well-placed cadence does more than a beta blocker. She almost laughed. Then she felt a knot in her throat. She didn't plan to go. Truly, she told herself she'd just walk past to see the building. Remember how she used to sneak into student rehearsals there? How the wood floors smelled of wax and rosin. Nostalgia? Not intention, but her feet had other ideas. At 6:20, she stood outside the music Verein. It wasn't the grand entrance that was for gala nights in black ties. This was a side door, smaller, quieter. A few people were already going in. An older couple, a young man in a worn jacket, a woman carrying a tote bag full of knitting. No one spoke. No one rushed. They moved like people entering a library or a chapel. Inside, the air was still and warm. Soft light came from wall sconces, casting long shadows. There were no rows of stiff concert seats. Instead, comfortable armchairs and low couches were arranged in a gentle circle. Some faced the center, others turned toward windows, looking out on a quiet courtyard. A single Steinway sat open in the corner, but no pianist. Just a small table with a high-end audio system and a man in a gray sweater standing beside it. He smiled, nodded, and gestured for her to find a seat. She chose a chair near the back, not hiding, exactly, but keeping a little distance. Old habit. Doctors learned to observe before engaging. More people arrived. A nurse, still in scrubs. A man with a cane. A teenager, hood up, earbuds, dangling around his neck. He pulled them out and stuffed them in his pocket without being asked. Then the lights dimmed not too black. Just low, like sunset through drawn curtains. The man at the sound system didn't speak. He didn't introduce the piece, or the composer, or explain the therapeutic intention. He simply pressed a button, and the room filled with sound, not loud. Not dramatic, just present. A piano, solo, gentle. A melody that rose and fell like a slow breath. It was simple, just a few notes, repeated, varied, flowing into one another like water finding its path downhill. There was no rush, no climax building, no demand for attention. It simply was. She recognized it after a few bars, batched the aria from the Goldberg. Variations. She'd played it years ago in a master class, nervous, overprepared, trying to impress. She remembered counting the beats, worrying about the ornamentation, the pedal, the phrasing. She'd performed it. But this was different here. With no audience, no score in front of her, no expectations, it wasn't music to do. It was music to receive. Her shoulders, which she hadn't realized were hunched near her ears, began to soften, her hands resting in her lap. Uncurled, she noticed her breath, how it had been short. Shallow, stuck in her chest, now deepened. In and out. In and out. Matching the pulse of the music around 60 beats per minute. The same rhythm as a resting heart. She didn't try to focus. She didn't analyze the harmony or count the measures. She just let it wash over her, like stepping into a warm bath after a long, cold day. And then she wasn't sure when it happened. The thoughts began to slow. The replay of the morning's difficult consultation. Gone. The email she needed to send. Faded. The tightness behind her eyes. Loosened. It wasn't that she forgot her worries. It was that, for a few minutes, they didn't press so hard. They floated like leaves on the surface of a still pond instead of dragging her under. She glanced around. Just once. The older man beside her had his eyes closed. Head tilted back slightly, a faint smile on his face. The nurse sat with her hands folded, her chest rising and falling evenly. The teenager who'd still up had slumped deeper into the couch, one arm draped over the back, his face relaxed in a way that looked unfamiliar. Even on someone so young, no one fidgeted. No phones buzzed. No coughs. Just the music and the quiet company of other human beings, all doing the same rare thing, nothing, just being. Halfway through the piece, passage where the left hand holds a slow, steady bass line while the right hand weaves a tender melody above it, something shifted. A warmth rose behind her eyes. Then a tear, just one, slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. Not grief, not regret. It was recognition, like hearing a voice you haven't heard in years and realizing with a start how deeply you missed it. Not the voice itself, but what it meant. Safety, belonging, being known. The music was that voice, it said. You don't have to fix anything right now, it said. You don't have to be useful, it said. You are allowed to rest. She thought of her mentor, how he'd always said Bach wasn't religious music. Not really. It was human music. Music that understood order, balance, sorrow, and joy, not as opposites, but as parts of the same whole. Like light and shadow in a single room, the final notes came soft, unhurried, like a sigh of completion. The room stayed silent for a full minute after the sound ended. No applause, no chatter, just the quiet hum of the building, the distant chime of a tram outside. Then, slowly, people began to stir, stretching, smiling, small private smiles, nodding to one another, not with words, but with their eyes. She stayed in her chair a little longer. Her hands were still, steady. The trembling had stopped. She stood, pulled her coat on, and walked out into the cool evening. The rain had let up. A sliver of moon hung above the rooftops. The city was quieter now, the rush hour over, the streets glistening, the air clean and crisp. She didn't head straight home. Instead, she walked not with purpose, but with presence. Past the opera house, past the old bookshop with its green awning, past the park where leaves crunched underfoot. She didn't hum. She didn't replay the melody in her head, but something inside her had changed. It wasn't a solution. Not yet. The exhaustion was still there. The grief, the doubt still real. But now, beneath them, something else had taken root. A memory, not of who she used to be. The prodigy, the healer, the achiever, but of who she was. Underneath all that, a person, a listener, someone who could still be moved by beauty, who could still feel awe, who could still, after all this time, be brought to tears. By 13 minutes of gently unfolding notes, she stopped at a small square. Where a lone street lamp cast a circle of gold on the wet pavement, she took a deep breath. Deeper than she had in months. And for the first time in a long time. She didn't feel like she was holding herself together. She just was. The music hadn't fixed her. It hadn't promised to. It had simply made space quiet. Generous space for her to remember that she was still here. And that, for tonight, was enough. She walked home slowly. The city soft around her, the echo of the aria not in her ears, but in her chest, a quiet pulse. Steady and sure, like a heart remembering its own rhythm. The next morning, she woke up before her alarm. Not with a jolt, not with that familiar dread of a day already heavy before it began, but slowly, like surfacing from deep water into light. She lay still for a moment, listening. The apartment was quiet. Outside, a sparrow argued with a pigeon on the windowsill. A tram passed in the distance, its bell soft and far away. And then she noticed something else. Her hands, resting on the blanket, were still. No tremor. Not even a whisper of it. She sat up. Made tea, real tea, loose leaves in a pot, not a bag dunked in a mug. Watched the steam rise. She didn't check her phone. Didn't open her laptop. Just sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight pooling on the wood, and let herself feel the quiet stretch of the morning. It wasn't that everything was fixed. The weight hadn't vanished, but it felt different. Like a heavy coat she'd been wearing for years, and last night, for just a little while, she'd taken it off. And now she remembered what it felt like to move without it. She couldn't stop thinking about the music. Not the notes exactly, though they floated in her mind sometimes, like a half-remembered dream, but the effect. That slow unwinding inside her chest. The way time had stretched, softened. The way her breath had found its own rhythm, without her having to command it. What was that? she wondered. Was it just me? Or was it the music? She wasn't the kind to leap to conclusions. Years of training taught her to question, to look for evidence, to separate hope from fact. But this wasn't just hope. This was something she'd felt, deep in her nervous system, like a key turning in a lock she didn't know was stuck. So she did what she always did when something puzzled her. She went looking. Not online first, not with a quick search that would drown her in noise. She went to the old city library, the one with the high ceilings and the smell of paper and dust and wood polish, the kind of place where silence has weight and footsteps echo like whispers. She asked the librarian, a woman with silver hair pulled into a loose knot, glasses on a chain, if they had anything on music and healing. Not music therapy as a modern field, but older things. Historical, personal, things that might not be in textbooks. The librarian didn't blink, just nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this question. "Ah," she said, voice low and warm, like a cello note. "You mean the quiet kind of healing." She led her to a section near the back, not medical, not music theory, but tucked between history and memoir. A shelf labeled Sound and Spirit in faded gold lettering. There, she found things no algorithm would have suggested. A slim volume from 1952. The calm within the score. Notes from a sanatorium physician. Inside, handwritten in the margins, played Schubert's impromptus after electroconvulsive treatment. Patients wept, not from pain, but release. One said, "It was the first time in months I didn't feel hunted." Another book, leather-bound, missing its spine, letters to a young composer, written by a pianist who'd survived a nervous breakdown in the 1920s. One passage stood out. I could not speak for weeks. Words felt like stones in my mouth. But my hands remembered Chopin's nocturnes. I played them slowly, half-tempo, not to perform, but to breathe. Each phrase became a pause. Each rest, a chance to stay. She sat at a wooden carrel, sunlight slanting across the pages, and read for hours. Not skimming, not searching for answers, just listening to voices from the past, speaking across time about the same thing she'd felt in that small hall. Then she found something that made her catch her breath. A photocopy of a program from 1948, musical, rest periods for convalescence. Waldhaus Sanatorium, Switzerland. Listed were daily listening sessions. 10 a.m., Mozart Clarity, 3 p.m. Grounding 7 p.m. Sati surrender beside Sati. Someone had written in pencil, gymnopody, no. One played at 48 BPM, not 63. Requested by patients. She'd known of Eric Satie, the eccentric French composer who wrote pieces with instructions like a nightingale with a toothache or light as an egg. But she'd always thought of the gymnopodies as background music, pretty, but slight, decorative. Now she wondered. Later that week, she visited the Austrian National Sound Archive, a quiet building tucked behind the Opera House. All hushed corridors and climate-controlled rooms. She explained what she was looking for, not recordings for performance, but for listening, for healing. For people who couldn't sleep, who couldn't settle, who couldn't find their way back to themselves. The archivist, a man in his 60s, sleeves rolled up, ink stains on his fingers, didn't laugh. He didn't tell her it was anecdotal or not evidence-based. "You're after the medicine tapes." He disappeared into the stacks and returned with a small wooden box. Inside, carefully labeled in faded typewriter ink, Waldhaus Sanatorium 1948. Session 7. Evening Stillness Performer. M. Dubois. Piano note. For nervous exhaustion cases, played in dim light. No talking before or after. He set up the reel-to-reel player, an old, beautiful machine with brushed steel and warm wood, threaded the tape with gentle hands. Then he pressed play. The recording wasn't pristine. There was a faint hiss, the sound of time itself. And then, piano satius, gymnopody no. E, but slower. so much slower than any version she'd ever heard. Each note given space, room to bloom, to fade, to leave its echo in the air. The pauses between phrases weren't empty. They were full like breaths held in shared understanding. Halfway through, a voice came on, quiet, feminine, with a French accent softened by years. Not singing. Not speaking over the music. Just, after a long pause, barely above a whisper, breathe in and let go. Then silence again. Then the next chord, she sat perfectly still, her eyes filled. Not with sadness, but with recognition. This wasn't entertainment. This was care, deliberate, tender, human, after it ended.
Ow.
The archivist handed her a folded piece of paper tucked inside the box. A nurse's note. Scanned and preserved. October 12, 1948. 3 men attended tonight's session. All veterans. All nonverbal since arrival. After the music, age 28 asked for paper. Wrote, "The music didn't fix me. It made me feel safe enough to remember I'm still here." She folded the note carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Carried it home like a talisman. That night, she didn't go to bed early. She sat at her small desk and opened her laptop, but not to work. She searched for the stories behind the music she'd heard. Not the famous premieres or royal commissions. The quiet moments. She read how Johann Sebastian Bach, father of 20 children, church organist, overworked and underpaid, wrote the Goldberg Variations for a count who suffered from insomnia. A nobleman who couldn't sleep, tossing through long dark nights. Bach didn't write a lullaby. He wrote an hour-long journey, an aria, then 30 variations. Then the aria again, like a walk through a garden at dawn, returning home changed. But still yourself. She read about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart how, in letters to his father. He confessed to lying awake for hours, his mind racing. How he'd get up in the middle of the night and play the piano quietly. Just for himself, not to compose, not to practice, but to settle the storm inside. It's how the slow movements of his piano sonatas often came first, the calm before he'd let himself write the fast. Dazzling parts she read about Ludwig van Beethoven. How, as his hearing failed, he didn't stop composing. He listened inwardly. How he scratched, must it be? And it must be. Into his notebooks, not in despair, but in dialogue with himself. How the second movement of his Emperor Concerto, that deep, singing adagio, was written when he was nearly deaf, in a world growing silent around him. He wasn't writing for applause. He was writing a lifeline for himself, and for anyone else clinging to the edge. And then she found Fanny Mendelssohn. Her story hit differently. Sister of Felix. Equally gifted. Trained in the same household, the same teachers, but told gently but firmly that music was not a career for a woman, only an ornament. So she composed in secret. Hundreds of pieces, songs, piano cycles, a string quartet, all tucked away in notebooks, shared only in private salons. One collection stood out, Das Jar, the year, 12 pieces, one for each month. Not grand gestures. Small, intimate reflections on seasons, on memory, on quiet joy and gentle sorrow. She listened to September, at the river, a piece that moves like water over stones. No drama, no virtuosic flourishes. Just a melody that flows, pauses, reflects, continues. It felt like watching light move across water, peaceful, but alive. A line from a letter Fanny wrote to a friend appeared on her screen. I do not write for the world. I write for the moments when the world feels too loud for the space between heartbeats. She sat back, turned off the laptop. The room was dark now. Except for the glow of the street lamp outside, she thought about all these people Bach in his study. Mozart at midnight, Beethoven in his silence. Fanny at her piano in the drawing room, not writing for fame. Not chasing immortality, but trying to stay human. Trying to find peace in a world that demanded so much. They weren't saints. They got angry. They doubted. They struggled with money, with family, with fear. But in their music, especially in the quiet pieces, the slow movements, The gentle repetitions, they offered something rare, a place to rest, not escape, not denial. Rest, a space where you didn't have to explain, fix, or perform, where you could just be tired, tender, unfinished, and still belong. The next day, she called the hospital, not her department, not administration. She called the head of patient experience, a thoughtful woman she'd met once at a conference, who'd spoken about non-clinical healing. "I have an idea," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, not tentative, not over-eager. "I'd like to try something small. A room, just one, with comfortable chairs, good sound. No charts, no white coats, just music. For people who are tired, not just in body and spirit." There was a pause. Then, "Tell me more." She didn't pitch it as a cure. She didn't promise data yet. She told the story, not hers. Not fully, but the one she'd found in archives and letters, and that one quiet evening in the music varying. She talked about Bach's aria for an insomniac count, about Satie at half tempo in a Swiss sonato, about Fanny Mendelssohn, writing for the space between heartbeats. She said, "What if we gave people permission to just listen? Not to get better faster, but to feel for a little while, like they're not alone in their weariness." The other end of the line was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We have that old consultation room on the 3rd floor, the one with the big window. It's been empty since they moved radiology. Too quiet for exams, but maybe not too quiet for this." A week later, she stood in that room. Sunlight streamed in. Dust motes danced in the beams. The walls were pale blue, not clinical white. There was a worn but soft armchair, a small side table, a bookshelf with a few nature journals and poetry collections, no medical texts. She brought in a good speaker. Tested it with the Goldberg aria. The sound filled the room, warm, clear, present, but didn't overwhelm. It sat with you, not over you. She made a simple list. 5 pieces, each chosen for its pulse, its space, its humanity. Bach cello, Suite No. 1. Prelude, 60 BPM. A single line, like a breath finding its rhythm. Mozart, Piano Sonata, No. 11. Adagio, before the Turkish march. Grace, lightness, like sunlight through leaves. Beethoven Piano Concerto, No. 5. Second movement, tenderness in the midst of struggle. A hand held in the dark, Fanny Mendelssohn, Das Jar. September, at the river flow. Reflection, the beauty of slowing down. Sati Gymnapudi No. E. Surrender. The courage to do nothing. She didn't call it therapy. She didn't call it treatment. She called it simply the listening room. On the first day, only one person came, a man in his 50s. He'd been referred by physical therapy, chronic pain, years of it. He walked slowly, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe as he entered, like he wasn't sure he belonged. She didn't ask his name. "Didn't take notes? Would you like some tea?" she asked. He nodded. She poured. Sat in the other chair, not too close, not too far. "Today's piece is about 10 minutes, she said. "It's just piano, slow. You can close your eyes or not. You can leave any time. There's no right way." He sipped his tea. Looked out the window at the trees. She pressed play. Bach's Prelude, Yo-Yo Ma's cello version. Warm and resonant. The man didn't close his eyes. Not at first, but by the 2nd minute, his shoulders dropped. By the 5th, his breathing had changed deeper, slower at the end. He was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I forgot what quiet felt like." He didn't say more. Didn't need to. He came back the next day, and the next. She didn't know his story. Didn't need to, not yet. But she was beginning to understand something. Healing isn't always about fixing. Sometimes it's about remembering how to breathe, how to be still, how to trust that. even in the deepest weariness. There is still a note waiting, soft, steady, true beneath the noise, and sometimes all it takes is someone brave enough to press play. The room stayed open, not with fanfare, not with posters or announcements, just a small sign on the door hand-lettered on cream cardstock. The listening room, come as you are. Stay as long as you need. Music begins at the top of each hour, and people came, not in crowds, not all at once, but steadily like water finding a dry riverbed, drop by drop. Some arrived by referral, a nurse who'd noticed a patient hadn't slept in days, a social worker who saw someone sitting rigid in the waiting area, jaw clenched, staring at nothing. Others came on their own. Word spread quietly. There's a room, just down the hall. They play music. You don't have to do anything. One woman came in slippers and a hospital gown fresh from post-op recovery. She didn't speak, just curled into the armchair like a child, pulled the soft throw blanket over her legs, and closed her eyes before the first note even started. 10 minutes later, she was asleep deeply. Peacefully, her face finally soft. A young man in his 20s sat near the window every Tuesday at 4 p.m. He never made eye contact. Always wore headphones into the room, but took them off the moment he sat down, as if preparing for something sacred. During Mozart's Adagio, that gentle flowing melody, his fingers, resting on his knees, began to move. Not tapping, not conducting, just tracing the shape of the phrases in the air, like he was remembering a language he'd once known by heart. No one asked questions. No forms, no intake interviews. That was the rule, unspoken but understood. This wasn't a treatment. It was an offering, like leaving water out for birds in winter. You don't ask why they're thirsty. You just provide the bowl. She kept the session short, 45 minutes, no more. Long enough to settle, not long enough to become obligation. She always started with Batch, the cello suite prelude. That single, singing line like a hand reaching out in the dark, saying, "Here, begin here." People responded in ways no spreadsheet could capture. A retired teacher, recovering from a stroke that had stolen her words, didn't speak during the sessions. But one day, during Fanny Mendelssohn's September piece, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small notebook, and began to draw. Not pictures. Just lines flowing, looping, rising, falling, like musical notation, like rivers, like breath. When the music ended, she held up the page. A single tear traced her cheek. She pointed to the drawing, then to her chest. This is how it feels inside. Another time, an older man, widowed, recently diagnosed with early memory loss, listened to Beethoven's Emperor Adagio. Halfway through, he began to hum. Softly, off-key. His daughter, sitting beside him, froze, ready to hush him, embarrassed. But the woman just shook her head slightly, smiled, and gestured for her to wait. He hummed the whole way through, not the melody exactly, but the feeling of it, the shape of the sorrow, the lift of the hope. Afterward, he turned to his daughter and said, "Clear as morning light. Your mother loved this one." We danced to it in the kitchen. With the lights off, she hadn't heard him speak her mother's name in months. These weren't miracles. Not in the flashy sense. No limbs were restored, no tumors vanished, but something quieter and just as vital was happening. A reconnection, a remembering, a softening of the walls people build when the world feels too sharp. She began taking notes, not clinical ones, just small observations in a plain notebook. October 14th, man in blue sweater fell asleep during Sati, woke up smiling, said, "I dreamt I was lying in a field. Wind in the grass. No pain." November 2nd, teenager hood up stayed after session. Asked, "Do you have more like the river one?" Played December from Das Jar. He stayed 20 minutes longer. Didn't speak. But didn't leave. November 10th, nurse sat in back corner during lunch break. Closed eyes. Afterward, I forgot I had a body. In a good way. One afternoon, a man came in who moved like he was carrying something heavy inside his chest. He wasn't a patient. He wore work boots, faded jeans. A thick jacket with a fire department patch on the sleeve, though he'd taken the cap off before entering. He stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room like he wasn't sure he'd come to the right place. His hands were big, calloused, resting at his sides, but she noticed how his thumbs pressed hard into his palms, over and over. A small, constant tension. She nodded. "Come in, please." He hesitated, then walked to the far chair, the one by the bookshelf, furthest from the door. Sat on the edge, back straight, feet flat on the floor, ready to stand. Ready to leave? It was Beethoven Day. She didn't announce it, just pressed play. The opening chords of the Emperor Concerto's second movement filled the room strings, deep and warm, like embers glowing in a hearth. Then the piano entered, tender, questioning. Full of sorrow and strength woven together, he didn't close his eyes, but his thumbs stopped pressing minute by minute. Something shifted. His breathing, shallow, tight at first, began to deepen. His shoulders, which had been pulled up near his ears, lowered slowly, like a boat settling into calm water after rough seas, at around the 7-minute mark, where the piano and orchestra hold a long, suspended chord, neither resolving nor rushing. His chin dipped, just slightly. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it, didn't look away, just let it fall. When the music ended, the room was silent. He sat still for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, voice low, rough. "Like gravel underfoot," my therapist asked. "What helps most?" Pause. He swallowed. I told her, "It's not what they say. It's what they don't say." Another pause. Longer this time, his hands now resting open on his knees. The space between the notes. "That's where I remember I'm still here." She didn't offer advice. Didn't say I understand, because she didn't. Not fully. She just nodded. Said thank you for sharing that. He stood, nodded back. Walked out without another word. But the next day, he was back. Same time. Same chair. This time, he took his jacket off before sitting down. The woman started noticing patterns, not rigid rules, but gentle rhythms. People who came before a difficult procedure often chose batch they needed order. Something steady to hold on to, those grieving or facing loss. Leaned toward Fanny Mendelssohn, or the slower Beethoven music that didn't rush past sorrow, but sat with it, honored it. People with anxiety, with minds that raced like engines stuck in high gear, they found relief in Satie. In those long pauses, in the permission to stop, she realized, it wasn't about the composer. Not really. It was about the space the music made. Like a room cleared of furniture, just floor, walls, light, room to stand, to breathe. To be one rainy Thursday, the young man in the hood came early. He didn't sit. He stood by the window, watching rain slide down the glass. She was setting up, adjusting the speaker. Checking the playlist, he cleared his throat. Do you ever play live?" he asked. Voice quiet, but steady. She looked up. "Sometimes. Not here. The piano in the staff lounge, it's a bit out of tune. But I'll play if someone asks." He nodded. Didn't look at her. "Could you?" "Maybe. Just once. Not for anyone else. Just, if the room's empty." She thought about it. "Sure," she said. "When?" He shrugged. "Tonight. After shift?" "I'll wait." She agreed. At 6:45 that evening, the hospital was quieting. Day staff gone, night shift settling in. The listening room was empty. She walked down the hall, found him sitting outside the door, not waiting impatiently, just present, like he was gathering himself. She opened the door, gestured him in. He sat in his usual spot. She went to the small upright piano in the corner, the one no one used, the few sticky keys and a lid that creaked. She lifted it slowly. Dust floated in the lamplight. She didn't choose something flashy. No sonatas. No show dubs. Just the aria batches. Simple. Perfect melody. the one that had found her that rainy night at the music varying. Her fingers hovered over the keys. They trembled. Just a little. Not the old nervous shake. This was different. Anticipation. Vulnerability. She took a breath and began. The piano wasn't perfect. The middle C was slightly flat. The sustain pedal clicked. But the music, the feeling of it came through. Slow, gentle, unhurried. She didn't play for him. She played with him, with the quiet, with the rain outside. With the weight of all the unspoken things in the room, halfway through, she heard a sound soft, almost lost in the music. He was crying, not sobbing, not hiding it. Just letting the tears come steady, quiet, like a release valve finally opening. She kept playing. When the last note faded, she let the silence settle long enough for it to be real, not rushed. Then she closed the lid. Turned, he wiped his face with the back of his hand. Didn't apologize. Didn't explain, just said, voice thick but clear, "My brother. He used to play this. Before the accident," pause. "I haven't heard it since. I didn't think I could." She didn't say I'm sorry. Didn't say it'll get better. She just said, "Thank you for letting me play it with you." He nodded, stood, walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned. "Do you think? Maybe I could come back? Just to sit? Even if no one's playing?" "Yes," she said. "Always." After he left, she sat at the piano for a long time. Her hands rested on the keys, not pressing, just touching. Feeling the cool ivory, she thought about all the people who'd passed through this room. The woman drawing rivers, the man remembering his wife, the firefighter holding his grief like something fragile, the young man letting tears fall for the first time in years. None of them had been fixed. None had walked out cured, but something had shifted, like a door cracked open, just enough to let light in. She realized that healing doesn't always roar. Often, it whispers. It's in the sigh after a long-held breath, in the hand that stops cleansing, in the tear that's finally allowed to fall, in the courage to sit in a quiet room and say, "I'm tired. I'm here." That night, she didn't go straight home. She went to the hospital chapel, not because she was religious, but because it was open and empty and still. She sat in the back pew. No music played, just silence. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like space, like possibility, like the quiet before a note begins, full of everything that might come. Next, she closed her eyes and listened, not for answers, just for the sound of being alive. Winter came softly that year, not with blizzards or bitter cold, but with a kind of hush, frost on the window panes in the early mornings, steam rising from manhole covers, the city moving a little slower, as if wrapping itself in an old quilt. Inside the hospital, the usual rush continued, beeps, pages, hurried footsteps, but down the hall, behind the unassuming door with the cream-colored sign, a different rhythm held steady. The listening room. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a place people carried with them. The retired teacher still came most Tuesdays. She no longer drew rivers. Now, she brought a small tape recorder, the kind with reels, old and reliable. She'd set it on the side table, press record before the music started, and sit back, eyes closed, hands resting in her lap, like two quiet birds. Later at home, she'd listen again, not to analyze, not to memorize, but to return. Her daughter told the woman, quietly, over coffee. She plays it when she can't sleep. Says it helps her find the words inside her, even if she can't say them out loud yet. The young man in the hood, he kept coming. Every week. Sometimes he brought a thermos of tea. Once, he left a small paper bag on the side table. 2 almond biscuits, neatly wrapped. No note, just the offering. He never spoke much. But he started sitting farther forward in the chair, less braced, more at ease. And one afternoon during sati, he didn't just listen. He leaned back, fully into the cushion, like he trusted it to hold him. Then there was the firefighter. He came most days now, not just after shifts, but before them too. He'd sit in the same chair, hands loose on his knees, and close his eyes the moment the music began. He never asked for anything specific, but she noticed he always seemed to arrive just before the Beethoven session, as if he needed that particular kind of tenderness before walking back into the world where strength was expected, where feeling had to be packed away like gear in a locker. One gray afternoon in late January, the room was empty, a rare lull between sessions. She was tidying up, refolding the blanket, when he appeared in the doorway. He didn't come in right away, just stood there looking at the chair, the window, the piano in the corner. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Of course, she said. "Room's yours." He walked in, took off his jacket, a habit now, and sat. Didn't say anything for a long while. Just watched the light shift on the floor as a cloud passed outside. Then, quietly, "I told my captain about this place." "Oh," he nodded. He laughed at first. Said, "You're going to sit in a room and listen to piano music? That's your stress relief?" A small smile touched his lips. I said, "Yeah, and you know what? It works better than the gym." She smiled back. "Didn't push?" he asked me. "What it does?" He looked at his hands. Big, scarred, steady. I didn't have the words, so I brought him. Her breath caught. He came. Last week. Sat in the back. Didn't close his eyes. Didn't move. Just listened. To the Mozart one. And he didn't say much after. Just clapped me on the shoulder real hard and said, "All right. I see it." A pause. Then, softer. Next day, he sent 2 of his crew. Said, "Tell that doctor if she's got space. We'll take it." She felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not excitement, not pride. Something quieter. Recognition. Like watching a seed, long buried, finally pushed through the soil. Word was spreading. Not through memos or meetings. Through trust. Through shared silence.